Welcome back to the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 1045. This is C Block, our third segment of the show. We have had some up and down weather in the last few weeks, ranging from just plain hot to freezing. And if you look at some news in the last, we'll call it 10 days, you might be confused about whether we're in drought or whether we're not in drought. Now, for starters, I want to point to a headline from the good folks from MissouriNet. The headline reads, Missouri governor extends drought alert through April 2026. And reporter Matt Pilger writes, the drought alert in Missouri isn't ending anytime soon. Governor Mike Kehoe has extended the alert originally issued on September 22nd, which was set to expire December 1st. The new expiration date is April 1st, 2026. When the alert was first declared, 85 counties and the city of St. Louis were included. Matthew continues, now 21 additional counties have been added, bringing the total to more than 100 counties under drought conditions. Kehoe says the extension is necessary because much of Missouri continues to experience moderate, severe, or extreme drought, and the state's drought response efforts remain critical. We should note that every county in our broadcast area, that's St. Charles County, Warren County, Franklin County, and West St. Louis County, are included in the drought alert. Kehoe's order also directs that any additional counties entering drought status will be added to the alert as conditions warrant. Now, the governor issued this last week, and as you know, starting on the Thanksgiving weekend, and more specifically on this past Monday, we all got a ton of snow. And it made us think, what kind of drought declaration do we have going on right now? Are we in La Nina? What about an El Nino? And what the heck does it all mean for this winter and next spring? Thankfully, there is an online resource for that. If you go to YouTube and you check out Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station, you will see a series called Tim's Take with Tim Reinbott. And just a few weeks ago, Tim sat down with state climatologist Zach Leasor to discuss the upcoming weather forecast and how it might impact the growing season going into next spring. Tim and Zach start off by talking a little bit about 2025's weather and what impact flash droughts have had. What even are flash droughts? Here's what Zach has to say.
Yeah, so, this year we really flipped the switch. It was wet in April, May, and June. And in fact, some areas in southeast and southern Missouri were too wet. April was the fourth wettest April on record for the state, with records going back to 1895. And a lot of that was from southeast and southern Missouri as well. So that started out the season. But once we got to July, really midway through July, I-70 and south in the state, the rain really shut off. That's been tricky to watch here, and it's really characteristic, though, of Missouri's climate. Being in the center of the U.S., we have a continental climate, which means we get all four seasons, but it also means we can get all of these air masses moving from around us. And so it's really easy to switch from maybe a wet pattern to a dry pattern. In this part of the country, in the central of the U.S., that's really a notable thing. And so the past 2 years, we've seen that switch from wet to dry so quickly that we actually call that a flash drought. Mm-hmm. And so that's different from a regular drought where we think about monthly or seasonal differences and kind of a long-term drought event. These flash droughts, once the rain stops and if it's really hot, like in July or August, you see conditions evolve in just a few weeks as opposed to throughout the season. And so that's been 2 consecutive years with the flash drought.
Tim asked about the effect of the jet stream. Here's what Zach had to say.
Yeah, so we're really prone this time of year for the jet stream to retreat far to the north, and then that leaves us just looking at scattered precipitation chances. So once that jet stream moves to the north, we don't get these big low pressure systems with the front moving through. where the whole state's going to get needed rainfall. Instead, like we saw this summer, even when we got some rain in July and August, it was these pop-up thunderstorms, and it was tough to really get a good rainfall from those. And so that's been tricky, and is something we're still seeing here as we're warm going into October, is no sign of that jet stream currently.
Tim offered some observations about when drought actually starts. Probably not in the spring, probably before that. Here's what Zach had to say.
So we don't always see a full growing season drought. And even just looking at the past 4 years, we've had a drought every year, but 22, 24, and now 25 were just kind of late season events. And so that's been interesting to me, learning about Missouri's kind of drought characteristics, because it has a lot of impacts on what the ag impacts are as well. Because if we saw this full growing season drought, we might have issues everywhere. But when it's certain times of the year, it really changes that too.
This week, we sure got a ton of moisture. And Zach talks about what that means for growers.
Yeah, so usually during the winter, on average, that's a time of year when we do see some soil moisture recharge. And so that's really important to have that precip as we go into the winter and even during those colder months, so that once we get into the spring next year, we're not starting with reduced soil moisture there.
When it comes to big weather events and big weather trends, we've all heard of La Nina. But what the heck is La Nada?
One thing we're looking for is the chance of a La Nina. And so last year was a La Nina winter. And when we look back for the state, it was characterized by a really active start to the winter. November and December, we had a lot of rainfall. And then we got into this cold and snowy pattern as well. And that's really what we typically see in this part of the country for a La Nina event. And so we're watching that now. The kind of factor that's making it a little bit difficult is La Nina is where we monitor the Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures. And when they're cooler than average, that's these La Nina events. And right now, the temperatures are actually closer to normal. We jokingly call it a La Nada because we haven't gotten to that La Nina yet. But the forecast is for over the next couple of months, the temperatures to cool enough where we're officially in a La Nina. But it's expected to be a really weak La Nina, just barely crossing that threshold, and then maybe not last that long. And so as a seasonal forecaster, that's usually the first thing we look at is El Nino or La Nina. That explains a lot of the variance for a season, but we don't have that tool as much if it's a weak or short-lived La Nina. So I'd be optimistic for a La Nina winter like last year where we did see drought recovery. But as of right now, that maybe cold and snowy or cold and wet forecast could be have a lot of uncertainty behind it too.
If you're just joining us on Westplex Talk 104.5, we're playing a few select clips from state climatologist Zach Leasor. Zach sat down with Tim Reinbott from the Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station. You can find that recording on YouTube. Just look up Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station. They have a full, fantastic podcast. We're just playing a few select clips from that recording, from that conversation here. Next up, Zach, what should we expect for next spring and summer?
These models that try and forecast the really slow changes of ocean temperatures, they are predicting us to eventually warm into an El Nino next year. But I will note that the models have really struggled this past year. I think they've been slow to the changes. They've been predicting this La Nina event to happen since this summer, but it kind of keeps getting pushed back. And so while next year could be an El Nino of a year, and that's kind of what they're showing, still a lot of uncertainty there.
Zach goes on to detail some of the biggest challenges for someone in his role to predict what's coming next.
So that's when we don't have as much kind of good, what we call composites or analog years. So when we don't have the El Nino or La Nina, that we see these characteristics, there's not as much of a consensus on what the weather will be. And so you see a lot of variability, and it's difficult to kind of make a forecast when you don't have this signal here. So, and this year, it's hard to tell if maybe as these surface or as these sea surface temperatures started to cool, is that why we got dry? Because usually a La Nina can mean a drier fall, but it's still such a weak La Nina, it's hard to really draw that relationship.
It was at this point in the conversation when Tim asked a really good question. Where exactly are we then between the La Nina, El Nino, La Nada? Where are we in that cycle? Here's how Zach explained it.
Yeah, so actually, we came out of La Nina last year, warmed into this La Nada. We were wondering if we would go into an El Nino, and then now have kind of dipped back into La Nina and will be over the next couple of months. So, and that happens too. You don't always flip from El Nino to La Nina. Sometimes, like this year, we can go to normal and then back to La Nina. So that's been kind of an interesting thing to see this year.
Zach went on to explain what specifically climatologists look at to predict 3 to 6 month trends.
2012 too, where we also went from that wet year in 2011, which probably led to a good harvest, but then dried out and got into really one of our more extreme, not just drought, but warmest year on record too. So that was a very strong El Nino event too. And so, and that observation is really why we watch these as climatologists, is because the ocean temperatures evolve so slowly that they really do have an impact on these longer term trends. So an El Nino is not going to help you forecast like a thunderstorm this week or with the 7-day forecast, but these, 3 to 6 month kind of cooling or warming trends, you can really try and follow that way.
So if you're like me, you might be thinking, what does water temperature near South America have anything to do with the weather we're going to see in our broadcast area? Here's how Zach explains it.
Yeah, so it's really kind of an interesting phenomenon, and it's a cycle and a feedback between the atmosphere and ocean as well. And so eventually what you get is a low pressure that sets up kind of stationary off the coast of South America. And so that low pressure is generally kind of rising air there at the surface, and that starts bringing up cooler water from below the surface there as well. And then your low pressure also sets up with a kind of a high pressure farther west, and you get this westerly flow, where now you move that cool water to the area of higher pressure too there as well. And so this kind of goes back and forth, this process where you'll develop the atmospheric pressure that pulls the water and then moves it across. And so basically you've got this dipole in the eastern and western Pacific of cooler and warmer sea surface temperatures. And so when we measure El Nino or La Nina, there's actually several different boxes, but the most commonly used is called the 3.4, and it's kind of just generally across the whole Pacific, but from 5 degrees south to 5 degrees north. So that's where you'll really see those changes in the water temperature.
Zach goes on to explain why what happens at the equator matters to us.
But we really see the global effects, because there at the equator, this kind of starts where we see our global circulation patterns, where ultimately the jet stream and all these highs and low pressure, they're really designed to move heat from the equator to the poles. And so when you change what's going on at the equator, it really changed kind of the patterns as well. And so that's why it's so important in that area in the Pacific.
Tim brought up a good point, which is you see in news reports and on social media, visuals of ice floating in the ocean, maybe departing from a polar cap. Does that really matter to anything?
Yeah, so that's where it gets tricky. So we've seen quite a bit of sea ice loss in both poles, including the Antarctic, and that can impact global sea surface temperatures as well if there's enough kind of ice there. So as a climatologist, we're kind of constantly trying to look at these sea surface temperatures relative to normal. And so, there's a lot of uncertainty with the ice, because it doesn't just go into the ocean and immediately cool the water. It can also impact sea surface currents, which impact how different temperature of water kind of piles up in the oceans there. So we're measuring the sea surface temperature in this box, but if it is changing due to other factors, we might be a little bit off on what our La Nina or El Nino is.
All right, so to sum it up, Zach, what do you see coming for the very end of 2025 into 2026?
For me, I'm looking for kind of an active pattern in the winter, and could be snowy, especially once we get into January and February when we see most of our snow, and maybe cooler temperatures there as well.
Now, Zach also added a little bit of context comparing the most recent years of drought here in our area and across Missouri to historical drought patterns.
We've gone now 4 consecutive growing seasons with drought, and I've gotten the question, how rare is that in Missouri? And these have been severe droughts as well, going up to D2 or D3 on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And so looking back at our climate, we do see these long stretches, but it is getting pretty rare. So some of our longest droughts ever would be from 1931 to 36. We had 5 consecutive growing seasons in the Dust Bowl, maybe some relief in the winter, but if you look at just April to November, they just kept getting hit with drought. And then also the early 50s, so 1950 through 54, 5 consecutive drought years there. So we're not as extreme each of the past few years as some of those in the 30s and 50s, but if we saw another drought year, that's one of the longest stretches on our climate records. So it has been kind of an unusual drought stretch there.
Zach also gives a nod to new, more drought-tolerant hybrids.
I don't have a lot of expertise with the yields, but when I look at the climate data and then corn yields, for example, in Missouri over the past 30 years, you see this increasing yield, and it's sometimes hard as a climatologist to look at that year and see maybe a drought or no drought and the impact it has on the corn, because they've definitely become more resilient, and you still get high yields when the weather's not perfect.
Tim and Zach wrap up with a discussion of historical drought and also the value of cover crops.
Even comparing, we mentioned 1980 earlier in 2012. Yeah, it was 12 was just as bad as 80.
Sure.
But we had a lot more corn yield.
Yes.
And soybean yield. So our breeders are helping us out a lot on that.
Yeah, and it's exciting for me too, because all I do as a climatologist is tell us how dry it is. But it's good that there's hope. Others are finding ways to address this situation where we're going to see drought in Missouri. What practices or what breeding techniques can make things more resilient?
Yeah, I know we take a lot of soil data in the summer without cover crops, and we're seeing that we have more soil moisture in the middle of the summer with a cover crop than we do without.
Yes.
Little things like that we can do.
Yeah, and I definitely, coming from a non-ag background, but talking to farmers about drought, hear a lot about that. They're thinking about solutions like cover crops or what different forages can they plant that might be a little bit more resilient to drought. And so that's really interesting to learn about as well.
All right, if you want to check out that full conversation between Tim Reinbott and Zach Leasor, go to YouTube and check out Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station. This one happens to be Tim's Take, episode 42. That's all the time we have this week. Remember, you can always join us on Facebook at Farm Show Radio, on Instagram at Farm Show Radio, and on YouTube at Farm Show Radio. We'll see you right back here next week at 10 a.m. on Westplex Talk 104.5.